Hi, everyone. We're ready to get started with our first ever Payment Innovator series. My name is Adrian Sanders. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Chargehound, and I'm here to interview some of the smartest people I know in the world of payments about things like fraud, all things fintech, just to give our community in general insights into what the businesses are doing nowadays and people's careers. And I'm super excited to introduce today's guest, Logan Vander Linden. Say hi, Logan.
Hey, everybody.
Logan has, an incredible track record in the industry in the payment space, more than a decade of leadership experience. He's currently the head of Scribd, one of the largest and fastest growing ebook and audiobook subscription services that includes over 1 million titles. Prior to that, he was the director of payments, partnerships, and ops at Airbnb, where he was responsible for leading that team, the payment partnerships team, and the payments ops teams. He personally built the partnerships and operations functions for payments and grew that team over 3x under his leadership. And before that, he was the director of global payments at Digital River, where he worked with merchants to help them expand into new markets, grow revenue in existing markets that they had, and to optimize their payment offerings to consumers. And in today's convo, we are going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And it's something that I think everyone in fintech runs into, whether they're a merchant or a vendor or anyone in the space, which is build versus buy. So obviously, Logan has had a number of opportunities to explore that in his career. But before we get into all that, Logan, why don't you tell us in the next 30 seconds or less how you ended up where you are today in payments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, payments isn't a discipline that you go to college for. Head of payments is not a role that anybody as a child aspires to be. And like most people, I fell into it accidentally. I was actually working at E&Y doing tax prep. And I had an opportunity to take a temporary job with a payments company to open up their San Francisco office. And I did no interchange from interstate. This is the sort of common joke that I toss out there. And, I was responsible for the cross-functional alignment meetings during the sales opportunities where the risk team, the product team, the salespeople, and everyone else would sort of vet out the opportunities that they had. And through that, I got a pretty good foundation in how payments worked. And at the end of my 6-month engagement, I had the decision to go back to EY for tax season or go full-time into payments. And I decided to go full-time into payments. There's something there.
Tough choice.
Well, yeah. When you put it like that, yeah. But it was also an amazing understanding that the whole world runs on this system that, by and large, the majority of us are oblivious to. And it happens in nanoseconds. All these different counterparties are touching data and actually touching funds. And we operate as if it's for granted. And that definitely intrigued me and made me want to learn more and get deeper into it.
It really is kind of like a black box if you don't know that world. I think about just my mom texting me like, how do I check out on this website? And you can explain it like, yeah, push this button and put these numbers in and these symbols in, and then, your shoes will show up in a week. But it's like, once you start to really delve into payments, you're like, underneath the surface, how many things are actually happening while she's doing that, right? It's incredible.
Yeah, well, and I come from Iowa originally. We were farmers, and trying to explain to my family what I do when I work in payments. Eventually, I was like, it's like PayPal. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I gave up on that long ago.
Yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you're doing now at Scribd and how different it is from what you've done in previous positions and previous places.
Yeah, well, I first off, being the head of payments is somewhat of a complex title because there's a lot that goes into it, setting payment strategy as well as thinking about the organization and how you staff up the teams and scale the organization for the future needs. So I like to think of it as a nice intersection between the actual thinking and the doing, the planning and the executing, and really just being an enablement function for the different leaders that are on my team that have their respective functions that they need to control. So we have product engineering. We have a finance director. We have a fraud, trust, and safety head, Brian Davis, who you guys will get to know later, who's primarily managing the Chargehound relationship today, but obviously, in my past, I've had a lot of experience with Chargehound as well in my previous company, and I think where I really like to spend my time now is in that alignment between the internal needs of the merchant and the future of innovation and the way that the industry is going to go. I was very fortunate at Airbnb to have a big platform to talk to the card schemes, to the banks, and to all the innovators, and to really try to push the agenda of innovation in the payment space. And my goal at Scribd now is to extend that to Scribd. And subscription merchants have different use cases and different needs than other traditional e-commerce merchants. That's been a fun part of this role for me is getting to know the different nuances of that world. And obviously, fraud, chargebacks, when your primary focus and your primary OKR that you're trying to drive is a reduction in passive churn, understanding your fraud and your chargebacks is one of the key components of that. And so actually, when I first joined Scribd, fraud and trust and safety reported through a different part of the organization, and that was part of the change that I wanted to bring about, was to closer align the metrics, not only, but also the people who are making the decisions around those different facets of our business.
Yeah, I think churn is such a fascinating thing that, again, like you mentioned with subscription or SaaS, right? You obsess over it, but for e-com, it's like, what does churn even mean? And so it's so interesting that, on the surface, you go to a website, you buy a product or you get a service or whatever, it seems all the same, but the strategy around how to actually make a profitable business and grow a business, so different, right? If your churn is 10%, right? It's like everyone is all hands on deck, right? Whereas for ecom, maybe you have a 10% fall off in a month and you're like, well, we'll get it back on Christmas time, right?
Yeah, it's an adjustment in mind state. You go through particularly for subscription merchants, you go through all this effort to attract the customer in the first place, to get them on board. You have active churn, which you try to address, but the passive churn where nobody has indicated to you that they don't want the service anymore, but you still can't capture those funds, is a real, it's a real dial on the revenue of the business if you can improve it. And if you have growth goals, you can really use that as a mechanism to achieve those. And it's also an area where if you don't watch it like a hawk, you're going to start, just being like a leaky bucket and just see it come out the back end.
So, I mean, the topic for today, build versus buy, kind of goes into, I think, a lot of this, what we're talking about now, which is, like you mentioned, you were at Airbnb, really able to see things that most merchants, probably, smaller merchants, don't ever get exposure to, aren't able to have conversations around. And I think, you and I've talked about this in the past, that just what can be done in payments from a merchant's perspective. It's like, how long is a piece of string, right? You can optimize and you can work on literally any aspect. There's like millions of different things that you could focus on. And so I think one thing I would love to hear from you about, as we talk about build versus buy, is just like, when do you go internally and say, yes, we roll this out, we home grow this process or this piece of technology? And when are you like, there's no point to doing that, right? And we need to go out and we need to go with a vendor and make that decision. Is there like a process that you do to sort of like in your head to go through that and think that through?
Yeah, of course. And it's a process that you're constantly refining and that you're, trying to customize for the specific need that you have and what you're trying to solve for. I think the first sort of core fundamental that I think about when I'm trying to make this decision is, how central is this functionality to our core business, right? How much of this is this an area where if we develop that, it becomes part of our right to win in our space versus the rest of our competition. And if that's a yes, then how difficult it is or how long it's going to take, that just comes down to a resourcing question. And that's a pretty easy decision then when you think about it. It changes the discussion to not if, but when, and at what point does it make sense to in-house, right?
Right.
And then there's this huge category, and that's going to be 5% of your use cases that you can think of. The other 95%, it's like, no, that's not central to what we're trying to do.
Right.
And then it just becomes an ROI analysis. How expensive is that third party versus how cheap and how quick could I build it in-house? Now, from that could be, you could have that methodology from the beginning, and you can set that out. What employing that methodology repeatedly, in my experience, has showed me is that, it's very difficult to build. Even if you have the best of intentions, even if you do the best estimates in the beginning to sort of really understand how complex the problem is that you're trying to solve, then having people in your organization who are engineers who are willing to dedicate the sort of passion and energy to that is very difficult. You can't just take people who came to a company to work on one set of problems and divert them towards something that they have no experience or no inclination to try to want to work on and expect that to turn out well.
Yeah.
And, it's a pretty audacious goal to just build anything with technology, because it just requires constant maintenance. And even if you build it perfect the first time, and even if you retain your staff for 20 years, things are going to go wrong. And in payments, in particular, you're dependent on an outside world, which is constantly changing. And so you're not just signing up for that initial build, you're signing up for that build plus maintenance forever, potentially.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's got to be a really expensive third party to make you want to try to in-house it, in my opinion. And it has to be, again, something that you think you have the will to maintain and to continue to invest in for the long haul.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. When we talk about it internally, is could we build our own email campaign management tool? It's sure, if that's what we want to do, it's probably something we could build, but it's okay, who wants to go and learn about spam, right? Who wants to learn about spam filters? Who wants to learn about how to A/B test subject lines? Or do we just roll out, whatever mail campaign tool, that someone else has dedicated their life to solving this esoteric problem for, right? And it's very rare that we come across a thing where we're oh no, we absolutely have to build this component, right? Tell me a little bit more about, okay, so you oftentimes, like you said, buy seems to be, especially on the payment side, the way that you lean. But even if you do buy a product, there's integration, right? And so you still, it's not like you just can get it off the shelf and it works. Tell me a little bit about experiences that you've had there, if there's one in particular, or even generally, where you've had to bring in a product and you've had to sort of navigate building excitement in the engineering core internally to, learn this product or adopt it or whatever, and maybe challenges you face there.
Oh yeah. And everybody's motivation is different, right? We all like to think that we, as an organization, can set top line OKRs or goals or financial targets, and that somehow that then immediately translates down to the micro level of how the work that people are doing contribute to that. But the reality is a lot of times it's difficult for people to make that connection between the work that they're doing and the actual value, unless you have someone who makes it a point to go back and articulate that, right? And so inevitably that's always been a big part of my role, is trying to bridge those gaps and trying to articulate to the doers and the people who are creating how that directly translates to financial value for them, financial value for the company. Again, when we work in these environments where employees are stakeholders and shareholders, that becomes an easier conversation. I think that's a great way to align incentive and to make sure that they understand that. And then it's about impact assessment. This is something that actually I've learned from the executives that I've worked with, is that they're always having to make decisions about how to trade off resources in areas that are often very difficult to compare. And until you can come to some unified understanding of what the impact is and how that translates to, business impact, it's very difficult to make trade-off decisions. And in payments, whether it's through a partnership or through development resources, there's always more, something you alluded to earlier, there's always more things than you can do than you'll ever have time to do, right? So you have to inevitably spend some of your bandwidth in that qualification and analysis point. And so, specific to the point about my experience with bringing on a project, you can have a project that has tremendous financial impact, but if it also has reduced manual intervention, improved operational component to it, really tight documentation, really easy to understand how you bring people along from the beginning to the end. Because that's the other thing, is that I think oftentimes people think they can just go to an engineering group or a product manager group and just say, hey, $50 million or something like that. And they're just going to be like, But these are smart people. They're going to look at you and be like, okay, whatever. How? How are we going to get there? What are the steps?
What is the
Right?
catch?
Yeah. So if you don't start with like, here's how we're going to integrate, here are the milestones, here are the exact sort of like end result that we hope to achieve through that, and then here's the impact and the outcome. It's like anything. You have to be passionate and motivated to create something, and if they're not inspired, they're not going to give their best effort.
Yeah.
So it's about like building that understanding, that inspiration.
Yeah, and I think like that's a really good point that I feel like we try and think about a lot too, is like all like product collaborations and all partnerships are narratives, right? And they're stories, and like the story is to get people on the same page, right? You're trying to create this alignment. And because once you do, right, like you said, it's like every piece of it that you can sort of reduce friction, and you're just like, yes, this is with the documentation for the integration. All right, that's one less question I have to answer, right? This is the ROI. This is like the impact for these orgs. This is the benefits, right? But if you're not sort of couching that in a larger narrative, like you said, of like, what does this mean for Scribd, right? Like, how does this impact us in this positive way? You just have a bunch of people like kind of every once in a while being like, wait, why are we doing this again? Or like, what was the point of this, right? And I think especially in payments, which is already a rabbit hole, right? Like, I don't think I've ever been in any sort of industry or worked on any sort of projects that are as rabbit holey as payments, right? And it's like, oh, when we were learning, when I was learning about it, it's like, yeah, okay, so there's issuing banks. And they're like, yeah, well, there's acquiring banks. And I'm like, what's an acquiring bank, right? And it's like, after a while, it's like you said, versus interchange or interstate, it's like, there's just so much random stuff that has a real impact, right? And so people, I think it's not like their fault that they get caught up on some component of it, right? Because, we're trained to sort of consider all these angles. But a narrative really helps sort of filter that, where it's like, yes, I know that this is a component of it, but like, this is where we're going, right? And this is why we're going there. Especially for engineers who like in payments, where they're like, okay, if I mess this one thing up, or we overcompensate or do too much of this, the ramifications are very real, right?
Yeah.
So that really resonates with me. You don't have to name names, but have you ever been in like sort of an experience where you have sort of made a buy decision and you look back and you're like, whether you felt like you should have built in-house or just not the right vendor, like able to look back at that and figure out what you would have done differently, or could you have avoided that,
Of course. And less the category where we should have bought that, more so the category that we didn't use the right evaluation criteria when we were making the decision. And oftentimes it has to do with the lack of understanding of your own infrastructure. This is a mistake that I'll never make in my career again. Any decision I make with regard to partnership, I'm making the actual engineer who has to do the integration, like sign off before we sign the contract that this is going to work. And again, what we're talking about, what we're scoping is going to work. Because it's happened too many times where the tail wags the dog. And payment systems in particular are particularly susceptible to technical debt. To that point before about prioritization and trying to sell a story to an engineer. Imagine if you're an engineer that's sitting there working in an addled, antiquated system, and you have your own 10 different ideas about projects that the engineering team could work on to make your life easier and to make pushing code and quality and all that stuff easier. And you're talking to business people who never pay any attention to that and just come back to you and say, oh, we want you to turn on this next thing.
Like wavy.
Just put another sticker on there and just make it work,
Godspeed.
It's gotta be maddening. And so, the way that you make a mistake in partnership is adding complexity to something that is already about ready to break. And that then becomes the tipping point that makes it all fall apart. And then it causes, it's not just the fact that partnership itself.
Cascading effect.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the cascading effect.
Yeah. And it's just like, because everything was being stress tested around this one point of failure. And like, here we are. Right. And I think that's tough, right? Like, I think one of the biggest challenges with like scaling anything, and especially in payments, is like, well, you don't actually know whether or not it's going to break until it breaks sometimes. And like, there's not much you can do about that, right? Like you can put safeguards in place, but like, I think especially with COVID, right? Like, and we talk about this a lot internally, that like, no, like we talked to merchants who in 2019 were like, yes, we're going to go from 10% of our volumes online to 20% of our volumes online in 2020. And we talked to them in 2020 and they're like, 90% of our volumes are online, right? Like, well, there's no planning for that, right? And so when you talk about stress testing or, point of failures or things are going to break, it's like, well, what are you supposed to do, right? So that's a really interesting point, though, that, basically technology, sometimes when we're on the partnership side and especially on the business side, we take for granted what product and engineering teams can and can't do. And I especially think it's true that when we get excited about something, we want that thing to work, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it won't work. I think conversely, can you give me an example of when you just like hit a home run on a build versus buy, where maybe you had internal conflict where people were adamant on build and you were able to sort of, really come through the other side on a buy?
Sure. And I promise you didn't pay me for this. I think that anytime when you have a solution that requires manual intervention and you can replace that with a solution that's automated, and that just scales better. And when you talk about unforeseen changes in your business, unforeseen swings in activity, if your chargebacks are being manually represented and all of a sudden fraud shifts from being offline to online, and you went from a volume that was manageable under that to a volume that's unmanageable, that's a pretty clear cut example of where technology can always be better prepared to respond to market changes than any sort of manual process would be. I think that there's also sometimes you can go for a more costly option on the surface, but because you're lowering operational burden and because you are activating opportunity in other areas of your business, you're not suffering from that lost opportunity cost of investing in something that isn't really profitable for you. People will make the wrong decision about partnership because they went for the lower cost option on the surface, but in reality it's the much higher cost option in the actual core metric that you're trying to drive, which is profitability for the business, right? So there have been times where I've had opposition from finance, for example, saying that partnership is too expensive, but without understanding the real cost of that, you can make the wrong decision that way. So that's been also something that I think it's easier when you're aware of what all the ancillary costs are that are associated with those programs. And so part of my job then is just to educate others on what are the hidden costs that they're not thinking of. Yeah.
And I just feel like that's such a payments truism that like, if you don't understand payments, you don't know, like, it's like, well, they're giving us interchange at this rate and like, perfect, let's sign up. And you're like, okay, can we ask like 10 more questions before we just sign this contract, right? And then it's like, wait a minute, we lose a ton of money if we do this, right? I just think that's, it's such a good example. And I think it's hard to sort of pitch being, don't be penny wise and pound foolish, right? As the English say or whatever but like, it really is true in payments. Like, you're trying to think, you can't think about the next quarter. You have to think like 3 years ahead sometimes. I think one of the things that I want to just visit briefly a little bit is something that I've noticed is this, obviously, like I said, with COVID and sort of a rapid sea change in online transactions and sort of buying behavior. But I really think that we're seeing this big wave in technology and payments. And it's not just, the payment processors are catching up and they're driving innovation. I think what I'm seeing is the sophistication on the merchant side of them as buyers of technology, right? And like the demands, right? It used to just be like, great, you can accept credit cards online, like sign me up, right? But now, people like yourself, right? It's extremely sophisticated and the demands are very different than what they used to be. And I think one question I have for you is like, you're always pushing for the cutting edge and like, how do we reduce operational complexity? How do we, do all these things? Is there a piece of advice that you give to people in your space when they are pushing that bleeding edge of tech and trying to find that edge, is there sort of a general mantra that you have or framework that you use to sort of think about this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, in that you need to look at the consumers, because as much as the merchants push the envelope, the consumers are light years ahead of the merchants.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the rest of us are brought along kicking and screaming. I remember when I first got into payments, like 2000 and probably like 11. Or maybe even it was even a little bit before that, because the smartphone, which I think was 2008, had just started to be ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in one of these merchant roundtable discussions, and someone on the panel said, "I want to just be able to, take my phone out and pay." And literally, big merchants, I'm not going to name any names, but like big merchants, we were proud to be part of that as thought leaders, laughed. That'll never happen, and so like, never underestimate the rate of change that we're going through now in this age. When 5G, when the Internet of Things, when these things start to take off, payments is going to be completely upended, and the old ways of doing things are just not going to stick around, because I think human beings are inherently quick to adapt. I think anything that's more convenient and that is more intuitive, people flock to and can't wait to tell their friends about. And there's a bit of pride that you get in being up on something and knowing something that's better than somebody else, right? Same reason that all these different apps have that sort of wow factor when they first launch, and then they reach a point where they become ubiquitous, and then it almost starts to like fizzle off.
We'll all be on Clubhouse eventually, right? So.
Oh yeah, exactly. And Bomani X will give us all the updates every 5 minutes.
Great. No, it's that's a great point, that it is. And I think I lose track of that sometimes. It's like the consumers are why payments exist, right? And I think that I was thinking about this the other day when I went somewhere to pay and I wanted to use Apple Pay and they didn't have it, and I'm just like, it was just so annoying. But I didn't use Apple Pay at all before COVID, right? But now I'm just like, why would I ever do it any other way? But it's like, that sea change just like happened for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But our QR codes, like I always thought that was like an absurd idea, and now I'm like, wow, no, that makes total sense, right?
Yep.
So I think that thinking about that for us in the payments industry is like, how do we help? Like, technology is supposed to make these processes better, and so how are we able to do that? Like, that really is should underline any of the sort of the decision making, for sure. We're coming up on time, so I just wanted to wrap up with one last question. You've been at Scribd now for just about a year. Would love to know what's in store for you in 2021, at Scribd, but also anything else that you're sort of excited about on a personal level.
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, I think we are. We've had a lot of really great momentum in our original content. Like any streaming provider, we've had this very fortunate setup where we have all these user-generated documents that have driven a lot of traffic to our website and to our app, and that's great. And what we find is that by offering original content that's also from known publisher or from known authors and from known content providers, that also deepens the engagement with our user base. We want to make sure that when you think about Scribd, you're not just thinking of them as a competition for other ebooks, but just for general leisure time activity and for entertainment in general, right? And so audiobooks and sheet music and magazines and professional slide deck presentations that can start your journey into learning about something new, and then if you want to go super deep and find all the details, then that access to that information is there as well. Yeah. So that's awesome. Really exciting to be part of that journey. And again, continue to see how we as an industry can find ways to curb fraud and to allow for secure transaction of money across this network. And then, maybe my wife one day will get me to stop buying all these records. But I doubt it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think so.
No.
Well, awesome. Logan, thank you so much for kicking us off this inaugural event. I'm always a pleasure to chat with you. for everyone else listening in, thank you so much for tuning in on this first ever installment of the Payment Innovator series. Got a ton of great guests lined up coming. Look out for future episodes on our YouTube channel and on our blog. And we'll see you again soon.